webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about how to crush the MCAT CARS and Chem Phys section of the MCAT. The reason why we're talking about these sections is because these are the two sections of the exam that students struggle the most with. So we'll be focusing on them today. In subsequent webinars, we'll also talk about the other sections, the Biochem section, as well as the Psych-Soc section. So let me go ahead and get our presentation set up here. All right, so first of all, let's just start by introducing everyone. So of course, my name is Ken. I am the MCAT Program Director for the MedSchoolCoach. I run everything MCAT related for the company, and I'm very excited to be here and help answer the questions that all of you attendees are going to have today, and also provide some effective strategies and techniques for these two sections. Rashad and Catherine, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and Rashad, we can have you go first.
Sure. Hi guys, I'm Rashad. I went to Duke University and graduated in 2016 with a degree in biology. Since graduating college, I've been working as a teacher through Teach America. I teach high school chemistry and physics in a rural county in North Carolina. And I'll be starting med school this upcoming fall.
Awesome. And my name is Catherine, and I attended the University of Miami and graduated in 2018. I studied biochemistry and neuroscience there. And now I'm actually in my gap year, and I'm applying this cycle to medical school. So I'm excited about that.
All right, great. And as I'm sure all of you can see on this slide, Rashad and Catherine both did really fantastic on the MCAT. They got some of the highest scores on the exam in the entire nation. So they're really going to be able to provide some excellent tips and strategies for the Chem, Phys, and CARS sections today. So just to lay out the plan for the webinar today, we're going to start off by having a discussion on why the Chem Phys and why the CARS section are so challenging for students. And from there, we're going to start first. We're going to take a look at the Chem Phys section. All of you are going to have an opportunity to tackle a few questions yourself, see what the Chem Phys section is like. Then we'll discuss some strategies. And from there, we'll do the same thing for CARS, chat about why the CARS section is so difficult. We'll provide tips and strategies. We'll then discuss very briefly about how MedSchoolCoach can help you with your MCAT preparation. And then we'll spend the rest of the webinar answering questions that you have. So I highly encourage you, all of you throughout this webinar, to use the Q&A feature. Just at any point, if you have a question that comes up from our presentation, just type it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to cover it at the end of this presentation. Okay, so first of all, on this slide, we do have an overview of the MCAT exam. So you should be familiar with the fact that there are 4 sections: the Chem Phys, the CARS, the Biochem, and the Psych-Soc section. Each section has a much longer name, which I'll let you read on the slide. And the MCAT is scored between 472 to 528. 500 is an average score, and of course, the higher the score you can get, the better your chances of getting into medical school. And down here on the bottom, just some small details worth noting. The MCAT has both passage-based and freestanding questions. Every question is worth the same amount of points, and there is no guessing penalty on the exam. All right, so now let's chat about the Chem Phys section. What makes the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems so difficult for many students? And the first thing I want to talk about is that this section integrates a broad range of subjects. If you look at all the sections of the exam, the Chem Phys section tests the most subjects. And you can see right here, it's got 30% general chemistry, 25% biochemistry, 25% physics, 15% organic chemistry, and 5% biology. That's a lot of subjects that students aren't used to seeing all at the same time. And it's not like you're going to see 30% of the passages are going to be on general chemistry topics and 25% is going to be on physics. You're going to see passages that's going to have questions on multiple topics. So you can have one passage with maybe 2 general chemistry questions, 2 biochemistry, and 1 organic chemistry. So the way the MCAT formats this section really would require students to be able to think about how these topics are related together. So how can you apply concepts of general chemistry and biochemistry? For instance, thinking about the acid-base properties of amino acids. And not just for those 2 subjects, but all the subjects. So as another example, how is general chemistry related to physics? Well, you can think about in physics, you have waves, sound, and light. And light is very much important in general chemistry, thinking about atomic structure, excitation, and emission of photons with electrons. A second reason why the Chem Phys section is so difficult is that there's a bit of luck factor involved. Now, I don't mean this by luck, as in it's not like you take your MCAT and you flip a coin, either do well or not. That's not what I mean here by luck. But here, when you're looking at all of these different subjects tested on the exam, it actually makes it look not so bad. But you really have to keep in mind that each of these subjects covers many, many topics. And for some, like physics, it's not just one semester of physics. You have 2 semesters of physics. And the first semester is usually Newtonian mechanics, and the second semester is electricity and magnetism. And when you're looking at the science sections of the MCAT, you have 59 questions. In physics, that's going to be about 25% of them. So you're going to have about 14 to 15 physics questions in total. That's not a lot of questions, 14 to 15. And when you think about the number of topics tested on the Chem Phys section for physics, there's a lot more than 14 to 15 topics. So what that means is on one exam, it might be very heavy on a few, like waves and fluids. And on another MCAT administration, it might have a bunch of questions on geometric optics and work and energy. So that's why there's a bit of a luck factor with the Chem Phys section that, sometimes students, they're just really hoping that they don't see some of those topics that they're really weak on. And that's just what makes the Chem Phys section difficult to prepare with, or difficult to prepare for, that you really have to have a strong content foundation and a really broad range of topics. Number 3, the Chem Phys section requires a complex set of reasoning skills. So this is not an exam where you just memorize a bunch of content and you're good to go. The MCAT has 4 types of questions for the Chem Phys section, and they test the skills that we have written right here on the bottom right. Knowledge of scientific concepts and principles, scientific reasoning and problem solving, reasoning about the design and execution of research, and data-based and statistical reasoning. These are not skills that you can develop from simply reading books, learning content. These are skills that you have to learn through practice. So you have to do practice questions and really learn about how the MCAT is going to require you to apply your knowledge of chemistry and physics to answering MCAT questions. And finally, another reason, and this is big for a lot of students, is the math, right? So for a lot of students, the math is a bit of a drag that they just hate doing calculation questions. And on the MCAT, there's no calculator. So you are expected to be able to do some simple math calculations. And yes, it takes time, which is why for the Chem Phys section, there is a bit of a time pressure. When you look at most students studying for the MCAT and you ask them which sections of the exam that they struggle with for pacing, the Chem Phys section is almost always one of those sections. And often it's because the calculations take so long. And also along with math, the Chem Phys section is really the only section of the exam where you have equations and constants you have to have memorized. And sometimes the MCAT is nice and they're going to provide you with some of the equations and constants, but it won't be provided for all of the questions. So there is some memorization you have to do here. Okay, so with that, what I want us to do is actually to take a look at a sample Chem Phys section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up a poll here so that all of you can go ahead and give this a try. And let me make sure I have this set to the right poll. And we're going to give all of you some time to look over this question. And once you think you figured it out, go ahead and put in what you think the answer is, and we'll go ahead and go over it together afterwards. All right, so let's look at what we have here. We have a number of you who have participated, and it looks like a number of you did quite well. So here the correct answer was C, so great job. The majority of you did get this question right, 63%, that's fantastic. So now let's chat a little bit about, for the rest of us, how to approach this type of MCAT question. Okay, so first of all, this is fairly standard as an MCAT question. And of course, you'll probably recognize this is for organic chemistry. So the question is asking, in the reaction shown below, which of the carbons in carbon 1 corresponds to the carbon marked with an asterisk shown in compound 2? Now, there's a couple ways that you can approach this. So the first way is basically using a brute force approach, saying, you know, this is chemistry, I'm going to use my knowledge of science to approach this question. So if you want to use that approach, then you would say, all right, if I look at this molecule, I can see it's some kind of organic molecule. And if I look at my reaction conditions, I'm running it under basic conditions because I've got a strong base. And if I have a strong base, bases remove protons. So if I'm going to remove a proton, that means I'm going to remove a proton from an acidic hydrogen on this molecule. Then when you're thinking about acidic hydrogens in organic chemistry, it's either going to be a carboxylic acid, a phenol, an alcohol, or an alpha hydrogen. In this case, the only acidic hydrogen in this molecule are going to be from alpha hydrogens. So if you're looking at alpha hydrogens, well, you have some here, some here, some here, and some here. But in this case, you have to think about which of these alpha hydrogens, if you remove, is going to form a compound that's going to result in the desired product, compound 2. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm not going to run through all the different possible combinations, but it turns out it's going to be this hydrogen on this carbon you're going to remove. If you remove a hydrogen from this carbon, then you're going to form an enolate with a negative charge on this carbon, which is going to make a nucleophilic attack at the electrophilic carbonyl carbon. And then when you form that product, you can go through the whole arrow pushing mechanism and you can see, oh, well, if I follow the mechanism, then my answer has to be carbon number 3. And that works completely fine, but you know, that can be a bit rough for students. So there is another way you can approach this, which is looking at strategy, right? And this is a very legitimate strategy on the MCAT, looking for patterns and trends. So if I look at my compound 1 and I compare this with compound 2, I'm trying to look for similarities between these two molecules. And one thing you might have taken note is that there are methyl groups, right? So here's a methyl group, here's a methyl group, here's another methyl group. And when you're looking at compound 2, there are also methyl groups. And in particular, you're looking for a region where you have 2 methyl groups that are adjacent to each other. And if you're looking at your reactant molecule, you do have 2 methyl groups. So you can essentially recognize that, you know, these 2 methyl groups must be these 2 methyl groups. And then if you're looking for this carbon in the asterisk, then you're just looking for an atom that's 2 carbons away. And if you go 2 carbons away, that will give you carbon 3. So that's certainly a different way you can approach this question. So something you want to keep in mind for the Chem Phys section, that it's not always brute force chemistry, but strategy can be helpful as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and try one more. So I'm going to go ahead and set up another poll here. And all of you, again, can take a few moments, think about this question, and enter in what you think the correct answer is. All right, let's see what we have here. So this one is arguably a little more difficult than the last one. So in this case, it's not the majority, unfortunately. It's actually the smallest group here. So the answer for this question is D. So 3 of you, of all of you that are present here, chose D. So really fantastic job to the 3 of you who chose D. Let's now chat a little bit about this question. So this question is a biochemistry question, and biochemistry is a really high yield topic for the MCAT. Among the natural sciences, biochemistry is the 2nd most tested subject after biology. So, you know, looking at diagrams like this with a line weaver birth plot, you know, very high yield topics that you definitely want to make sure you review and know very well for the exam. So now, how do we approach this? Well, for those of you who are familiar with line weaver birth plots, you know that you have these axes. The x-axis is 1 over substrate concentration, the y-axis is 1 over reaction velocity. And when you're looking at the graphs, you should take note of a few things. That first of all, your x-intercept, this is -1 over km. Your y-intercept, this is 1 over the Vmax. So when you're looking at this graph, you have one condition where you have just the enzyme chloride dismutase, and you have another graph where you are adding in chloride, seeing how it affects the enzyme activity. And since there is a change in enzyme activity and looking at man choices, you know it has to be some kind of inhibition. So the next part then is figuring out, well, which one is it? And as you know, if your intercepts are related to Km as well as Vmax, that can allow you to eliminate some answer choices easily. First of all, you can note that the x-intercept changes, right? The x-intercept with or without the chloride is not the same. That means Km has to change. And if Km changes, well, in this case, it actually doesn't end up being super helpful in eliminating answer choices because, you know, Km changes in all of these. But the next thing you can think about is, how does the Km change? In this case, your x-intercept shifts to the left. That means it becomes a larger value. In order for it to become a larger value, that means that your Km must have decreased. And if your Km has to decrease, that allows you to eliminate one answer choice, which is C, because in competitive inhibition, Km increases, it doesn't decrease. You're still stuck between these 3. So then you can go for the Vmax, which is the y-intercept. Again, you can see that the y-intercept changes. Since the y-intercept changes, you know that the Vmax has to change. So if the Vmax has to change, well, again, that might not be super helpful because the only thing you can really recognize from this graph is that you know, competitive inhibition is wrong because that's the only one where Vmax doesn't change. So again, you can look at how Vmax changes and you can see that your y-intercept moved up, which means again, your Vmax decreased. And if your Vmax decreases, if your Vmax decreases, then that does allow you to look at your remaining answer choices. And for these different answer choices, again, it doesn't help too much because there's not much change going on, right? And sorry, I actually made a small mistake here. Because the Km changes, that also allows you to get rid of non-competitive inhibition, because in non-competitive inhibition, you don't have any change in the Km. So if you're then between B and D, it is a little tricky. You know that both the Km has decreased and the Vmax has decreased. And that does match both uncompetitive inhibition and mixed inhibition. But the difference you have to note here is that the slope with the chloride is not maintained. So in uncompetitive inhibition, the Km and the Vmax change by the same amount. So if they change by the same amount, you should end up with parallel lines. In this case, since you don't have parallel lines, that means that B is incorrect. So the answer here has to be D. And sort of just to summarize the points that I was trying to make here. So when you're looking at non-competitive inhibition, Km does not change, Vmax decreases. In uncompetitive inhibition, Km decreases, Vmax decreases, but they decrease by the same amount. And finally, in competitive inhibition, the Km increases, the Vmax stays the same. So that's why in this case, our answer here is going to be D. Okay, so now that all of you have had a little bit of a taste of some Chem Phys questions, let's now talk more about strategies. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Rishav, who's going to talk about some helpful strategies for the Chem Phys section.
Thanks, Ken. Hi, guys. So here are some of my tips for doing really well on the Chem Phys section. And so I think this one is kind of obvious, but my first tip is that you have to practice, practice, practice. Unlike some of the other subjects on the MCAT, not only is it important to know like the vocab words and the concepts related to chemistry and physics, but it's really, you should really be spending most of your time in Chem Phys working on practice. So the majority of your study time should be dedicated towards practice problems, not just learning content. And when you're doing that practice, I'd really recommend that you simulate conditions that you'd encounter on the MCAT. So by that, I mean that you should do problems maybe 59 at a time. That's the length of the Chem Phys section on the MCAT. You should time yourself and give yourself 95 minutes for those 59 questions. You should work without a calculator because you don't get a calculator on the Chem Phys section on the MCAT. The problems that you do should be multiple choice problems. They should be passage-based problems. So simulating the way that questions work on the MCAT should help you develop the skills that you need to do well in this section. And so I mentioned earlier that you don't get a calculator, and I think Ken mentioned that as well. And sometimes that tends to be one of the scariest things for students, that they have to do math without a calculator, like 1950 or something. And so something that you should realize is that you don't need to be too intimidated by the math, that the math that you should encounter on the MCAT will not be anywhere near as difficult as the math that you encountered in a college physics class or in a college calculus class. That really the math skills that you need are math skills that you probably have already. You should be really good at algebra. You should be good at trigonometry. You should know how to do exponents. You might need to know how to do dimensional analysis. But the MCAT tends to make math pretty easy. And oftentimes, in fact, on the MCAT, the math works out so that the number that you get at the end is a round number, is one that's easy to calculate. And so don't be intimidated when you see math. That more than likely the math they kind of help you out in the math. And then in addition to that, when you're doing these practice problems, you should really be using the practice problems that are the gold standard, the best practice problems that you can get. And so there's a limited resource for those good practice problems, but the best ones tend to be the ones that the AAMC, the organization that makes the MCAT, creates. So they give a set of practice questions that you can purchase through their website. And those tend to be the most useful because they really should give you a sense of what the Chem Phys section is going to be like on the MCAT. If you exhaust all of those questions, there are some other sources that you can go to. Specifically, there's a company called UWorld that has really good questions. And there's a company called Next Step that has pretty good practice exams. And so you should always be relying on the best practice problems that you can. I don't really recommend using too many of the Princeton Review or the Kaplan practice exams. In addition to that, when you do the practice problems, I think sometimes students will do the practice problems, look at their score, and then walk away. And you've kind of wasted the practice problems if you do that. The whole point of the practice problems is not just to give yourself a sense of what the MCAT should be like, but to figure out what you need to work on, what your weaknesses are, what your strengths are, to learn from your mistakes. And unless you go back and review every single problem that you got wrong, or every problem that you weren't 100% sure on, you're not going to gain those kind of side benefits of doing practice problems. And so you should be going back and reviewing all of those problems. And when you review those problems, you should determine what your weaknesses are, what topics, what subjects you know are going to be difficult for you if you encounter them on the MCAT. And you should really focus your time and energy on those specific topics so you can take those weaknesses and turn them into strengths. So here's my second tip. So my second tip is that you really have to commit high yield content to memory. Ken mentioned how that earlier that this section is unique and that has a lot of equations and constants that you have to memorize. And so for every single one of my students, I ask them to keep a running list of all the physics and chemistry equations in the front of their notebook. These equations, these are really like the toolkit that you have to work with on the MCAT, and they're your best friend when you're taking the MCAT. And for many students, I think the struggle that they have when they're doing chemistry or physics problems is that they don't know what formulas they can work with on that specific problem. And so you should be reviewing those formulas often and really have them memorized, because when you encounter a capacitor problem, immediately you should know all the formulas for capacitors that you can work with. it'd be really crazy to expect a carpenter or a plumber to do a job without knowing what tools they have on hand. And it's the same way when you're doing a physics or chemistry problem. You should know what equations you have that you can use to solve that problem. In addition to that, there's some other high yield topics that you should think about. The really important biochemical pathways tend to come up often on the MCAT. So these are like your glycolysis, Krebs, gluconeogenesis. So make sure you have a really solid understanding of biochemical pathways. And then lastly, what we've been seeing on the MCAT in the last few years is that it's trending more and more towards these experiment-based passages where you're expected to analyze and evaluate the data that somebody created from an experiment. And so because of that, you should really have a acute understanding of important lab techniques that important lab techniques in chemistry and biochemistry. And so for each of these lab techniques, you should really know how they work. You should know what they should be used for, and you should know what kind of data that they can produce. So that's my second tip for the MCAT. And my last tip for this topic is that you shouldn't just focus on high yield topics. That there's some there's some forums online that will tell you that there is some limited list of topics that you can just study, and that limited list is enough to do on the MCAT, and that's absolutely a myth. That Ken mentioned how it's really crazy that this one section has 5 different subjects that cover a wide breadth of science, and you never really know what topics are going to appear on the MCAT in physics, or what topics in organic chemistry, or topics in biochemistry will appear. And so there's no limited list of topics that you can rely on. And I think the most common example of this that I see is that students will read the first chapter in their book. They'll see that organic chemistry is just 15% of the section. They hated organic chemistry when they took it in college, and so they'll pretty much ignore organic chemistry. And then they'll take the test and they'll come to regret it almost every time. Even something like organic chemistry that shouldn't represent a large portion of the questions on the exam will feel like it's very important in the exam, because a lot of the passages come with organic structures, even if many of the questions are from biochemistry. And so you'll be encountering organic chemistry concepts and organic structures all throughout this exam, or all throughout this section of the exam. And my last subheading under this tip is that when you study, you should really be pointing out scientific connections that you see between subjects, because that's what the MCAT likes to do on the exam, that they like to take one passage and cover multiple different subjects within that one passage. So you might be doing a biology question, a biochemistry question, then you might jump to physics and chemistry. And so a classic example is lenses. If I have a passage on lenses, I could ask you about the anatomy of the lens. I could ask you about the biochemistry of the pigments within the lens. I could ask you about the physics behind lenses and light. And so every time you're studying a subject, you should be thinking about how can this subject connect to other subjects? How can this topic within this subject connect to other subjects that are on this section? And so those are my tips for doing really well on the Chem Phys section of the MCAT.
All right, thank you, Rishabh. And those are absolutely phenomenal tips. And with regard to the list of topics to study for from MCAT, all of you at some point or at some point in your studies should look over a document called the AAMC MCAT Content Outlines. That is a PDF document that is created by the AAMC, and it has a full list of every topic tested on the exam. So certainly before you take your exam, you want to go through that entire document and make sure that every topic listed you understand and you're familiar with that topic. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the CARS section. What makes the CARS section so difficult? So number one, no content knowledge required, right? And at first this sounds fantastic. You're like, I don't have to study anything for the CARS section, but that ends up not being true at all, because at the same time, it means that there isn't any content that you can study and feel prepared for this section. And that's because the CARS section isn't testing any content within the passage. It's really testing your ability to think critically about the material and reason through the passage. What was the author's argument? What is the author's view on the topic, right? And what makes this section really challenging is that if you think about the pre-med coursework that all of you will take towards applying for medical school, most of these courses aren't going to teach you these skills, right? Occasionally, some of the reading and writing courses that you take, you'll learn these, but for many students, these aren't skills that they ever learn in any of their courses. And number three, Another reason why CARS is tough is because it covers a huge variety of different topics in the past years. Now, again, you don't have to know any of these content. You don't need to know anything about art or history or linguistics to do well in the CARS section, but this is what also makes it a bit tough, that because a lot of students aren't familiar with reading these topics, they read a passage on philosophy and they're just so bored out of their mind when they're reading the passage. And if all you're thinking to yourself is, this is so boring, I don't want to read this, then it's going to be very hard for you to do well in the CARS section. And the last thing that's also tough about CARS is the time pressure, right? The passages in the CARS section are not short. You have 90 minutes for 9 passages, which is basically 10 minutes per passage. That doesn't sound too bad, but you have to read the passage and you have to complete questions associated with those passages. So this section, students often struggle with pacing here as well. All right, so now I'm going to pass it off to Catherine, who's going to provide some excellent tips and strategies for the CARS section.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken. So my first tip is that CARS is kind of like strength training, where you have to do a lot of work, heavy lifting to see any increases in your score. So what I mean by work is that you have to practice almost every day, and definitely every day if you're way below your target score. So my tip would be, if you're pretty close, 1 to 2 passages a day should suffice. And if your goal score is very far away, I would suggest doing even more than that, depending on how far away. And also, a thing that I like to do with my students, but you can also do with some of your friends who are studying for the MCAT, is have a teaching session where you bring a CARS passage that you've done and reviewed and hand it to your friend. And they'll have done the same thing and hand it to you. And then once you finish the questions, you'll teach each other the respective passages that you prepared. And this type of teaching practice really gets you in the mind of the test maker, and it makes you think critically about every single answer choice because you have to guide someone else to it. So I highly recommend doing that. And we can switch. Okay, so next is, who is the author? So I love this question. I love picturing in my head who the author is because it's quite interesting. If you're reading a very dull article on, I don't know, philosophy, try imagining what this person looks like who's writing it. Try to get into their mind. What made them want to write this? They had to have a reason. So if you try to empathize with the author, it'll be a lot easier to read. So next, you want to look for a language of emphasis. So if the author says undoubtedly, surely, especially, that's where the author is shouting at you, this is my opinion. So that's the best place to look for how the author feels about something. And then finally, you need to figure out who the audience is. So what kind of person would look this article up and actually want to read it? That's what you're supposed to be. So you have to read like you're that person. And also just try to think of the reason that the author wrote the piece. So what did they want to tell the audience? That's very important too. And that'll all help you get to the main idea of the passage. Okay, and then highlighting, friend or foe. So students love the highlighting tool, and that's great, but when you start out, I like to say if you've highlighted everything, you have effectively highlighted nothing, because everything on your page will be highlighted. And that doesn't really help you find the information you need to answer questions. So what I suggest to my students, and I find to be very effective, is read the whole sentence before you decide what's important. Or even better, you can read the whole paragraph before you decide what's important. And doing this will actually cause you to focus more on what you're reading, think about the main ideas you're reading, and then go back and reflect on the main ideas you're reading. So the reading time will actually serve to help you answer the questions and get you in the mindset to answer them. And lastly, so reflect before you act. So at the end of a passage, don't stressfully just run to the questions. Sit there for a few seconds and think about everything that you read. And you want to come up in your head with 1 to 2 sentences of the whole main idea. And I think that this is very effective because the answer choices will try to throw you off, but if you already sat there and said, this is the main idea, you're more likely to get those types of questions right. So those are all my tips. I use these a lot with my students, so I suggest that you try them out.
All right, thank you, Catherine. And I also want to emphasize again, if any of you have any questions, any specific details that you're wondering about for the Chem Phys or the CARS section, again, please feel free to use that Q&A feature, and we'll be answering all those questions at the end of this presentation. One other thing that I want to add about CARS is that strategies are very important, right? So there's a lot of students who, when they're tackling the CARS section, they're just like, oh, well, I read the passage, then I answer the questions, right? But when you see some of these strategies being applied and you see how effective they work, you can really see how your approach to CARS may not have been the best. And when you start to learn these CARS strategies and you start to see your scores go up, then you really start to believe in how effective these CARS strategies can be for raising your scores. Okay. And the last thing I just want to chat a bit about is how MedSchoolCoach can help. So, of course, we offer a complete MCAT program. We have fantastic MCAT tutors. You've heard Catherine talk. You've heard Rashab talk. If you want to work with tutors as qualified as Rashab or Catherine, certainly consider working with us. In addition to our fantastic tutors, we also provide an excellent MCAT course that focuses on all the high yield topics covered on the MCAT. The course is designed by other pre-medical students that have all scored 524 plus on the MCAT. So, again, really, really good scores. And when it comes to MCAT tutoring, this is something that we have figured out. So when a student signs up with us, they will complete an intake form. So we learn information about their background, their strengths, their weaknesses, and goals. We use that information to pair up the student with a tutor that's going to be able to help the student reach their goals. And during these tutoring sessions, we'll help with content if needed, we'll help with strategies, we'll really help the student with whatever they need in order to get to their target score. And as a final point, we have done quite well for our students. So you can see our average score improvement for our students is 10 points, and that's really quite impressive. So on this slide, you can see some additional general information about our tutoring program. We have a satisfaction guarantee. We have a score increase guarantee. We do very well to make our students happy and help them get to their target scores. So if you have any questions about our tutoring program, feel free to email us at info@medschoolcoach.com. You can, of course, also go to our website, medschoolcoach.com, to learn about our MCAT program. So what I want to spend the remaining time in our presentation then is to answer questions in the Q&A. So we'll just go ahead and start going through these questions, and if you have additional questions, just go ahead and add them in and we will answer them as they come in. So first question, why don't we have Rashaf take this one? How many practice tests do you recommend? You might want to make sure your mic is on.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. So this will vary from student to student, but there is a minimum threshold that you should be doing. And that minimum threshold is 4.5 exams. And the reason I said 4.5 is that the AAMC offers 4 full-length exams and a half of an exam called the guide questions. And so everybody that takes the exam should at the very minimum do at least those 4.5 exams. And for most students, that tends to be sufficient. Some students have extra time or feel that they want a better gauge of what their score will be. And if that's the case, then they can layer on additional practice exams.
All right, so next, Catherine, you can take this one. So the question is, when starting content review for Chem Phys, is it recommended to read 2 chapters that day and then do questions? Also, how many questions per day do you recommend?
Okay, so as far as 2 chapters a day goes, it depends on if you're studying full-time or if you're also working or in classes. So for an average student, it takes about 2 hours to read thoroughly for a whole chapter. So just keep that in mind. So if you have 4 hours to study a day, that's okay, but then you need time for the questions. And it's up to you how many questions you feel that you need to do, and it depends on your goal score. So if your goal score is very far away, maybe you want to add in a set of UWorld questions after and do a lot of practice, whereas for someone who's closer to their score, maybe they just do the questions at the end of the book. So this is something that you have to really think about the amount of time you have, and then make sure that you're getting a good mix between the questions and the books.
Yep, perfect. And also something that I want to add in here, which is studying for the MCAT is not like completing a checklist. So your approach should not be, if I spend 2 hours reading a chapter every day, if I do 50 practice questions every day, that's going to guarantee me any score, right? So, for many students, the amount of practice you need, the number of hours you need to study is going to depend on your own personal situation. So in the end, what's important is making sure that you are prepared for the MCAT to get your target score. And the best way to do that is through practice tests. If your practice tests aren't where they need to be, then do more practice, do more studies until you're able to get to your target score. We have a quick question here, which is in-person tutoring available? So unfortunately, we do not do in-person tutoring. All of our tutoring is done online using an online platform, but I would say as someone who used to tutor people exclusively in person, the online platform does have a lot of advantages over in-person tutoring, something certainly worth considering. Rashad, we can have another one here for you. Any suggestions on reviewing exams and practice problems efficiently, all while leaving time to review them later?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something that I'll start with, I emphasized this during the presentation, but you should review every single question that you either got wrong or that you weren't completely sure about when you took the exam. So some students will only review the questions that they got wrong. In addition to that, something that I emphasize to my students is that when you review the questions, try to read the explanations. Usually the book or the site, the source that you're getting the questions from will have an explanation. If the explanation doesn't make sense, you should go ask a friend, ask someone and see if the explanation makes sense. But just knowing why that answer was correct is not enough. You should also know why the other 3 answers were wrong. And in addition, you should take that question as an opportunity to kind of identify maybe a gap in your knowledge or a weakness that you have. And so let's say that you take a bunch of questions and you notice that I got 4 acid-base questions wrong in this section. That's probably a really good indication that you should go back and review acid-base chapters in your book. You should go online and watch the acid-base Khan Academy videos. That these questions are really there to guide your studying and guide your review. And that's how you should treat them.
Perfect. All right, so next, Catherine, if you want to take this one. For students who have not taken courses in a long time, so I presume this is someone who is a non-traditional student, and someone who scored a 479 on a diagnostic test, how would you go about reviewing content and integrating practice questions? And yeah.
Okay, so good question. And for a student like this, I would really recommend that you start your MCAT studies very far in advance. And this will give you time to adequately interact with the materials because you haven't seen them in such a long time. And that means that you'll have extra time to learn every single concept in a chemistry chapter, whereas someone who just took chemistry a year ago might not need as much time on that one. So starting early is a great place to start. And then as far as questions goes, you can perform the questions right along with your reading. So UWorld and Next Step have great resources for that, where you can figure out exactly what the topic of the chapter is and then do questions on it. So a longer study period is the biggest thing that I would recommend there.
All right, and Rashad, we have a question in the chat, which is Kaplan the best content book or books?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of book options out there. Most of my students use Kaplan, but I don't think, to be honest, that it matters too much. Kaplan is good, Princeton Review is good. I think the most important thing is that you get a set of books and you read them cover to cover without ignoring any of the chapters or thinking that you know some of the subjects well enough that you can just skip it. There is some consensus out there that I think Princeton Review has the most detail. So if you're someone that wants a lot of detail on the subjects, a Princeton Review is a good source. There's another set of books called Exam Crackers that has the least detail. And so if you're someone that has really struggled with these subjects in the past and really needs a really basic understanding, and your score target for that section might be a little bit lower, then you can use those. But I think in general, it doesn't matter too much which book resource you use.
All right, and Catherine, here, student is asking, how do you recommend reviewing missed questions on the CARS section? Should you redo the whole passage, or what should you do?
So reviewing or redoing? Sorry.
I think that's part of the question. How do you go about reviewing missed questions? And I guess the student is wondering if maybe they should redo the whole passage.
Oh, okay. I understand now. So yeah, that's a good question. So the strategy that I recommend the most is that you do a CARS passage, you pause, and then you review it in full. And this means reviewing all the questions you got right and all the questions you got wrong. And then after that, you would want to look at all the answer choices. So figure out why each answer choice that wasn't correct was wrong. So there you have to do a lot of digging in the passage. So the more you interact with the passage and critically think about the passage, that's really what builds up those CARS skills. And with regards to redoing the questions, that isn't as beneficial because you'll probably remember the answers. And there are plenty of CARS practice questions or practice passages out there that can help you review for the future. So I wouldn't recommend going back.
All right, so here we have a fairly similar question, which is, what should I do if I am missing the same types of CARS questions? So I'll go ahead and take this one. So it's true, the CARS section, while it doesn't test any content, there are certain types of questions that tend to show up over and over again. So for instance, main idea or general purpose questions. These are along the lines of, what is the main idea of the passage? What is the general purpose of the passage? Another example are weaken questions. Which of the following, if true, would weaken the author's argument, would undermine the author's argument? Or structure questions. Why did the author include this particular sentence in this passage? Why did the author include this sentence? Why did the author use this word? So there are certain types of questions that show up over and over again. And the first thing which you should do, which I think it seems like you've already done, which is great, is identify if there is a common type of question that you keep missing. You know, if you keep missing analogy questions, well, first of all, recognize that that is the type of question that always messes you up. Once you recognize that, then you want to do a thorough analysis of the answer choices, as Catherine was just mentioning. The question that you selected that was incorrect, why is that question or why is that answer choice incorrect, right? Why is that a bad answer choice? And also recognize the correct answer choice. Why is the correct answer choice what it is? And sort of the pattern you want to be able to identify is what makes a good answer choice, what makes a bad answer choice. So that way you're not falling for the same traps over and over again. All right, and here we have one that you can take, Rashad. How do you suggest going over full-length exams? How long should it take? I feel like I'm spending too much time on each exam.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about kind of my review strategy, but in terms of how long it should take, my recommendation, my rule of thumb to most of my students is that you should be spending about as much time reviewing the questions as you do taking the questions. And so that means for one section with 59 questions on the science sections, it should take you about 95 minutes to take the questions and 95 minutes to review the questions. And so with that being said, when I say review, I'm not just talking about like looking over, reading the questions and reading explanations. That review not only means understanding why that answer is wrong and why the other answers are, why that answer is correct and why the other answers are wrong, but also identifying those weaknesses, going back to your book, going back to some videos and taking notes on those weaknesses and reviewing those concepts. And so you should be lumping like both of them together. that as you review the questions, you should also be going back to your notes, back to your books, back to your whatever resource it is that you're using, and going back over the content that you know you're weak on.
Great. So here, Catherine, we can have one for you. Should I take a class that focuses on critical thinking so that I can do better on the CARS section?
That's an interesting question. So I've never heard of a class that focuses on critical thinking, so I wouldn't really know the merits of the class, but the MCAT is all about critical thinking. So there are better ways to learn the critical thinking, which is just by doing MCAT practice to see the way that the MCAT wants you to critically think. But if it would increase your confidence in your critical thinking skills, go ahead and take the class, because it wouldn't be incredibly irrelevant. It just wouldn't be the best critical thinking practice.
Yeah, and I concur with Catherine. It can be a little tricky in terms of, what that critical thinking in that class actually involves. Is that the same type of critical thinking that you need for the MCAT? So, certainly can't hurt, but you just have to think about, is that the best use of your time? Would it be better for you to take that course, or would it be better for you to just do more CARS practice questions? Okay, so next, all right, so Rishav, for a non-traditional applicant who needs a 20-point increase, that's a lot, would a January 2020 test be possible? Approximately 8 to 9 months of studying.
So I was a non-traditional applicant and took a few years out after college. But what I will say is that for anybody, even someone who's already scoring pretty well on the MCAT, I think a 20-point increase is going to be difficult. And so, not that it's impossible, but it's definitely something that will require a lot of time. And so I think the fact that you gave yourself 8 to 9 months is a good sign. I think 8 to 9 months should be sufficient for most students. There's like a balance there where some of my students, if they wait way too long to take the exam, they start forgetting the stuff that they studied like a year ago. And so I think 8 to 9 months seems like a happy medium to me for someone that has a lot of review to do. So yeah, I think it is definitely possible. But in addition to that, something I'll say is that it isn't just like guesswork. That as you are studying, you'll be taking practice exams, and you should be seeing score increases on your practice exam that are trending towards your target score. And so like a month out, 2 months out, you should know whether or not you're on track, whether or not you're going to be able to hit those targets that you've kind of outlined for yourself. And so regardless of what you do, don't walk into the MCAT knowing that you're not going to get the score that you need. You should already know what score you're going to score the day before, like, the weeks before you go into the MCAT because of your practice scores. And that should inform you whether or not you're ready to take the exam.
Yep, absolutely. And just to add, a 20-point increase sounds huge, right? And it is a very significant improvement, but it doesn't mean that it's not doable, right? Usually, these are the sorts of students who are starting with low scores, right? So for instance, if you're starting at a 490, a 20-point increase is a 510, and that is certainly a very reasonable target score. And we have many students who achieve those sorts of 20-point increases. Where things get tricky is, if a student is coming to us and saying they want a 20-point increase in 2 months, then, that becomes challenging. So 8 to 9 months, very reasonable. So absolutely. All right, Catherine, we have a question here, which is, let's see. Are the questions in MCAT review books like Kaplan a good place to start studying, or should I use other resources that have questions closer to what would be on the MCAT?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know a lot of students use Kaplan books for their content, but I really don't recommend the questions because they just don't emulate the exam in a way that I think is useful. So rather, I think that UWorld is probably the best source to go to for practice questions. If not, Next Step is also great, but I would stay away from those Kaplan questions because they really aren't going to help you as much as for your time that you put in as those other questions.
Right, and also just to emphasize, there are a lot of practice questions out there, but a problem with a lot of those companies is that their practice questions were practice questions from the old MCAT. So the MCAT changed in 2015. And rather than write new practice questions for the new MCAT, many of those companies just recycled their questions and just kept using them from the new MCAT. So that's why a lot of those questions aren't great. And UWorld and NextStep, these are companies that wrote questions exclusively for the new MCAT. So they are better questions, but also note that they aren't perfect either. So that's why, the AAMC questions are always going to be the best because they're all from previous MCAT exams. All right. Rashad, we have a question here. How do you recommend skipping questions and coming back to them later? I get worried that if I skip, I have to spend time rereading or remembering what the passage was about.
Yeah, so it's always this like delicate balance on the exam, I guess, where sometimes you encounter a question, you spent a minute or two on that question, you're not making any headway. I think at that point, you need to skip. Don't spend more than a couple minutes. Don't spend more than 2 minutes on a question, knowing that you're not making progress, and keep on trying at it unless you have time to spare. And so in cases like this, something that can really help is taking notes, especially for experiments. You should be what I like to do is for each paragraph, kind of summarize that paragraph in one sentence. And then for each figure, each experiment that they do in that section of the passage, I kind of summarize what the experiment's about. And if you come back to it later, more than likely using your notes and kind of the memory that you already have from the passage, you shouldn't need to reread. So when you encounter a question that is taking you a long time and you're not really feeling like you're making progress, go ahead and skip it because it's not worth your time. And if you have time to come back and review it, rely on your notes.
All right. So here we have a quick question. Is it easier to go from a 479 to a 500 or a 500 to a 510? So this is a little tricky to answer because it's always going to be situational. It depends on the student. Now, in this case, there are differences. One student is starting lower and looking for a larger improvement. The other one is starting at average and looking for a smaller improvement. So they're a little difficult to compare. What I will say, though, is that generally, the lower the score, the lower the initial score, in this case, 479, the more room there is for improvement, and the easier and the faster that improvements will be made. And not just because often when a student comes to us with these low scores, there are so many different issues that we're able to identify, and we can basically just start correcting them one by one. So content, strategy, pacing. And as you make each of these improvements one by one, the score just, basically it's just like walking up the stairs. It just continually increases. When you reach higher scores, for instance, when a student is at a 500, they're already doing a lot of the right things for their studies. Their pacing is pretty decent. Their content knowledge is pretty decent. So now, in order to further improve their scores, they have to aim for those harder questions, right? That either require more content knowledge, more advanced topics, or they need better critical thinking skills. And those harder questions can be harder to get right. So it absolutely can be done, but it's not so much like a lower scoring student where you can aim for those, low hanging fruit to make quick, easy improvements. All right, and here, Catherine, do you want to take this one? For a student taking a gap year and wanting to dedicate time studying for the MCAT, in what time span range is the most efficient to study in, and how far away from the MCAT should the student start studying?
Okay, so that's a good question. So as far as the gap year goes, it depends on when you're applying, because if you took a gap year and you're hoping to apply that spring and only take one gap year, you would have to, of course, study in the spring until May or maybe early June. But if you're taking 2 gap years, I would definitely recommend just doing a summer of studying. What I did, I studied part-time from March until May, and then I studied full-time from May until August. But that was because I wanted a huge score increase and I was very dedicated. So it does depend on what your goal score is, but I'd say that if you have the time, more time is better. instead of trying to do 3 to 4 months, you could try to do 5 to 6 months.
All right, great. So this is going to be all the time that we have. So if you have more questions about the MCAT or how MedSchoolCoach can help you, please feel free to contact us at info@medschoolcoach.com. Check out our website, medschoolcoach.com. Also, this webinar plus all the webinars that we host on MCAT preparation, on USMLE exams, complex exams for medical students, as well as medical school admissions, looking at the application process, interviewing, and so forth. All of these webinars we put on our YouTube page, so certainly feel free to check out our MedSchoolCoach YouTube page, and you'll find a lot of great and fantastic resources. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for attending, and of course, Catherine Rishaw for being fantastic hosts for this webinar.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.